Today I'm going to be showing you how I go about making a 90-45 degree lightweight single runner sled. You're going to need following materials: some 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood or MDF. I like MDF better because it stays flatter. A little bit of 3/4 inch Baltic birch, some hardwood for the runner, and just a few assorted tools. You're also going to need some epoxy and some 2.5 or 3 inch carriage bolts with lock nuts on them. The process is pretty simple. I begin by ripping my stock to the 3 inch width. I trim one end of it off and then butt that end up against a stop block that I have clamped to my fence so that the length is consistent from one cut to another. From there, I just set up some clamps and glue the two faces of each front and back clamp, or each front and back fence, to each other. And while that's setting up, I go about the next phase of the operation. I've gotten really quick at this. Once the fences come out of the clamps, the next step is to bore for the bolts, and I use a 5/8 inch Forstner bit for this, but it really depends on the carriage bolts themselves and what size socket it requires. The Forstner bit is really allowing clearance for the socket to go into that hole, and then the Forstner bit will create a pilot hole for a 3/8 inch drill bit to go all the way through that the bolt is going to go through. Since the bolts are 1/4 inch and you're making a 3/8 inch hole, you're going to have about a 1/16 inch of clearance on either side of the bolt, so that allows for a little bit of adjustment once you get it bolted to the base of the sled. For the base itself, you're going to do the same thing, the same 5/8, but you're only going to go deep enough so that the head of the bolt barely is sunk below the surface. And don't forget to keep in mind that those bolts have a little bit of a square biting surface underneath the crown that has to be driven into the wood. So you don't need to allow for the thickness of that square part, just the bolt head itself, because the bolts are going to be epoxied into the base. Once you've drilled out for the countersink, go back and drill through with a 1/4 inch bit. You want a nice snug fit on that. The carriage bolt will go right through the 1/4 inch hole. Then I move over to the workbench and I put the bolts in place, and I apply some epoxy to the underside of the head itself so that when the bolt is driven into place and pulled into place by tightening it up with the nut, it seats it, and that bolt is never going to go anywhere else, and you don't have to worry about it spinning in the hole. It's important that the head of the bolt be below the surface or just flush with the surface. Slightly below is better. So you want to make sure that you have everything handy and ready right there to draw those bolts all the way into it. I just drive them in as best I can and then flip the whole thing over, put the fence onto the bolts, and put the nuts on there. One little trick that I think is really handy is to have a stack of rare earth magnets right there, because dropping those nuts in there and trying to get them started on the bolt holes is not easy. If you put a put them on the end of a rare earth magnet, you can just screw it right in, then pull the magnet off and go to the next one. And while that's setting up, I take some washers or pennies, either one will work fine, and I place them into the miter track and put the runner right on top of those things so that the top of the runner is just barely above the surface of the table saw. Then I position the sled base on top of that, and I want it positioned so that when I cut the 45-degree miter on the left side of the sled itself, if you have a left tilting blade. If it's right tilting, you'll just reverse that step. But in the right hand miter, I'm going to apply a little bit of glue, and you notice those two stop blocks that are between me and the fence right there. What I'm doing is referencing simultaneously off of the fence and those two stop blocks with the sled base so that it's positioned as squarely and accurately as I can get it without having to go back and readjust or trim or anything else. It's not absolutely critical that sled base be perfectly square, but the better you can get it, the more accurate you are with this step, the easier it is later on. Then I just put a heavy weight on top of that and let the glue set up for 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever. Once that's through, you can take that off and flip the base over, and we're going to use a pin nailer or screws to countersink and secure that runner permanently to the base. I just put a little bit of glue on that runner when I set the sled base on there enough that it stays in place, but then come back with a pin nailer and secure it. Then I usually use an 1/8 inch round over just to knock the sharp edges off of the fences anywhere that it's going to be exposed. And I also do the ends. I've cut myself several times on those sharp edges, so you want to sand it off or round it over with a router bit, one or the other. Then from there, I clamp the rear fence onto it in position, and I line up the right hand edge with the right edge of the sled, flip it over, and come back with a finish nailer and drive some nails through it. You just want to be sure that the location of the nails is not going to interfere with the position of the blade when you make the cut going through. You wouldn't want to cut through those nails. And you don't need to glue the rear fence in place, because if you do, once you make the 45-degree trim that cuts the end of the base off, you want it to come off and not be securely attached. Then it's a matter of final fitting. You reassemble the fence onto the sled base and put it into the the left hand miter slot. I've got it in the right hand in this picture, but I'm going to move it to the left hand miter slot, because the first cut is going to be the 90-degree cut going all the way through the sled. The position in the right slot is only for cutting the 45-degree miter. So secure the fence onto it, and before you get it completely tight, put a good square up against it, and you're going to want to position the fence just as square as you can possibly get it with the square, and tighten everything down. Then you're going to make your first cut on a test piece, check it for square, and if you're really, really lucky, then you're not going to have to worry about doing any adjustments, but 9 times out of 10 or more, you're going to have to loosen the bolts and just tap the fence on the left end in, either to the right or up or down, in order to get it squared, and just keep doing test cuts until you get it just as square as you possibly can. Then from there, it's a matter of going to what's called the 5-cut method of squaring, which I've put a link on the email that you're getting so that you can check it out and do any final squaring off of that. Once you've got it square, move it over to the right-hand miter slot, and you're going to want to do the initial cut for the 45 degree. It's always a good idea to ensure that you're at 90 degrees and 45 degrees before you make these cuts. Otherwise, the kerf is going to be wider than what it will be when you're actually using the sled. And you don't want a wider kerf because a lot of times you're indexing off of the kerf rather than anything else, off of the stop block or whatever. Hope this makes sense to you. If you have any questions, you can email me or give me a call. But it's a fairly simple, straightforward process of doing this. If you have any questions about the 5-cut method, let me know, and we'll see if we can get them answered for you.